State sets are a way of creating presets for scene conditions, such as render settings, the visibility of objects, whether lights are on or off, or whether materials are assigned to objects. And in 3ds Max 2018, a new method for creating and editing state sets was added, and that is the compositor view. So let's take a look. Open up from the rendering menu, State Sets. And we see the traditional state sets tree view with no states currently. Let's open up the compositor view. From the menu inside the state sets window, click Compositor, Compositor View. And you can navigate, of course, with the standard keyboard and mouse shortcuts. I can zoom out with the mouse wheel. If you see a compositor output node, don't worry about that. You don't need that for state sets. That's only there if you want to export to layered PSD. So I'm going to select that and just delete it with the delete key. Let's create a new state. Right-click in the graph and choose Add State. And then give it a name. Double-click on the name here, State 01. And we'll call it Preview. I'm going to create a render preset for a preview rendering in Arnold. Press Enter. And now we need to add some properties to this state. And down here, we will see some inputs on the left. And the one that says Add State is a little bit misleading because we're not really going to add a state to this state. We're going to add some properties. Click on that input port, hold the mouse down and drag out, and you get a little plus sign on your cursor. Release the mouse and you get a pop-up menu from which you can choose a properties node. Let's choose Render Output Size. And that's created, and it inherits the settings from the current scene. So if we go into the Render Setup dialog, we'll see that in the Common tab, my current width and height are 854 by 480. All right, I'm going to close the Render Setup dialog because if we have that open while we're working with these properties here, we're going to see some issues with the window flashing, and I'm just concerned about it being unstable. So I'm going to close that. Let's add another properties node. Click on Add State and drag out. And let's choose Arnold Image Quality. And we have a node with lots and lots of properties here. I'm going to leave these at the defaults because these are actually draft quality settings already. So we've got diffuse samples of 2 and so on. And down here under ray depth, we've got only one diffuse ray bounce and one glossy ray bounce and so on. So I'm going to leave that as it is. I'll minimize this node so that we have a little bit more real estate to work with. And I'll add one more properties node to control the Arnold system attributes or parameters. Click again on Add State and drag that out. And this time choose Arnold System. And for a preview render, which might be an active shade render, I don't want to use all of the threads or processor cores on my computer. So I'll set the number of threads to -2. And when I do a preview render, Arnold will use all of the available processor cores -2. All right, that's our preview rendering state. Let's make another state for production rendering. Once again, right-click and choose Add State. Double-click on the name and call it Production. Now, we can't actually copy and paste the nodes in this compositor view, so we have to create them from scratch. So let's add another state here. Click and drag out, and it'll be Render Output Size. For production render, let's set the render output size to 1920 by 1080. We'll add another state, which will once again be Arnold Image Quality. And for my production rendering, I want higher sample values for diffuse samples. So increase that up to 5. Glossy samples of 3. And we also have refraction, which is transmission. These names are actually from Arnold version 4. And I'm using Arnold version 5. And these names are actually, this is part of 3ds Max and not part of Arnold itself, and that's why the names don't match up. But I'm going to set a number of transmission samples to 3 as well. Scrolling down a little bit, we can collapse some of this stuff. Under rays, I want 5 diffuse rays. And then we have glossy reflection and refraction. Well, again, these parameters are kind of deprecated in Arnold version 5. So glossy is actually specular. So I want specular ray depth of 3. Reflection doesn't exist anymore in Arnold 5, but refraction does. It's just been renamed to transmission. So I need 8 rays for transmission. All right, so those are the parameters I want for my production rendering. I can minimize that node. And finally, I can add another state, or property node rather, and it will be the Arnold system once again. And for production rendering, I want to use all of the available threads or cores minus 1. All right, so now I've got 2 states. It's all set up. We can go back to the State Sets tab over here to the tree view. And before we activate these, let's check in on our render setup. So go to the render setup dialog. And I've got width and height here. Just to demonstrate how this works, I'm going to change the output size to 1360 by 768. So that's the default state for this scene before any of these explicitly defined parameter states are actually activated. If I go over to the Arnold Renderer tab, we see that we've got draft quality settings here, and these settings are actually, once again, the same as the ones in our preview state. So just to demonstrate, once again, I can do something like increase the number of camera rays up to 5. And then in the System tab for the Arnold System settings, I've got Auto Detect Threads enabled, which means use all of the available cores. And the number of threads is defined here as -1, but it's grayed out because Auto Detect Threads is on. Okay, so hold that all in your memory because we have to close this render setup dialog before activating the state. Otherwise, 3ds Max may become unstable. So in the Common tab, I've got 1360 by 768. In Arnold Renderer, I've got 5 camera rays. And in the System tab, I've got Auto Detect Threads on with threads set to -1. All right, close the render setup dialog and then activate the preview state. And then reopen the render setup dialog. And we can see that width and height have been set to 854 by 480 as defined in our preview state. In the Arnold Renderer tab, the number of camera rays is set to 3 as defined in the preview state. And if we go to the System tab, we'll see that threads has been set to -2, but unfortunately, Auto Detect Threads is not a parameter that we can define with the available nodes in the compositor view. So in order to actually change the number of threads, we need to make sure that Auto Detect Threads is turned off always. So now I'll close the render setup dialog and just verify that my production settings are working as well. Activate the production state. Go back to the render setup dialog. And now number of threads is set to -1. In the Arnold Renderer tab, we have production quality with 5 diffuse rays and 5 diffuse samples, and 3 specular samples and 3 specular rays, and 3 transmission samples and 8 transmission rays. So that is a production quality rendering. And finally, in the Common tab, we have an output size of 1920 by 1080. I'll close the render setup dialog and deactivate that production state in order to go back to the default scene state. And that's how to use the compositor view in the State Sets dialog.